Well, let's talk about the BBC now, because we can just remind ourselves of the whole controversy over a clip of Donald Trump. This was broadcast on Panorama. It's meant to be the flagship current affairs documentary series the BBC has. They're in a big row at the moment. This was apparently buried, covered up. This is what happened.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you.
Now, see there, between Capitol and, that's a cut. Here's what Trump actually said.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
It's different. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that he then said the second part of the BBC's version.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we fight. We fight like hell.
Well, Stephen Pollard is a writer, former editor of the Jewish Chronicle. He's written an excoriating verdict on this in the Telegraph. And Stephen, maybe we could just start with the great paragraph you have in here about Clive Murray and the little clip, the little video that's going between so many different BBC programmes. Disinformation, you think you're winning, says Murray portentously as the clips roll. But wait, disinformation is up against the wondrous BBC, and the more you try to drown out reality, the harder we'll work to establish the facts. It's the pursuit of truth that gives us our calling. Hurrah for the BBC and its reporters, our fighters for truth. But the problem is that these rows about disinformation and not telling us the truth just keep coming. This one seems to be one of the most severe so far, Stephen.
I mean, the timing could hardly be more ridiculous, as it were, in that the BBC's launched this very glossy advert about how wonderful it is in terms of the way it deals with disinformation and fake news and AI and all that, with the last word of that video being "trust is earned." Well, that's about the only bit of the video that's actually true. Trust is earned, and unfortunately the BBC is going about it in a way that all it's going to lead to is increasing distrust. I think there are two issues that I think we need to focus on, really. One, obviously, is the fakery itself, which shows, it's not even about the BBC being cavalier with the truth. That, we're both journalists. We know there are some journalists who are a bit too, how can one put it? They get invested in a story and they don't necessarily look at all different angles of it. And you could say that with some aspects of, those of us who scrutinise the BBC and talk about the BBC's bias and so on. Sometimes I think that's the attitude. They only take one angle to a story, for instance, rather than looking at it in the round. But that's not the problem with this.
And in this case, it's Donald Trump is always wrong.
Well, but I think in this case, it's much worse than that, because it's not being cavalier about the truth. It's actually deliberately pushing out a distortion. They went out of their way to edit this, not in a way, in TV broadcasting, you can very easily edit speeches together in a way that's not misleading by making clear where the edit comes. You put a white line down so that people can see it. Just as in newspapers, I used to edit a newspaper, and one of the things you do when you're looking at a long speech is you take the highlights from it and you make it clear to people that you're taking different bits from it. But the issue here is that they used software to elide those different elements of the speech to make it seem deliberately as though this was one long speech, which it wasn't. But worse in a way than that, even worse, because I think it shows that this isn't about bad actors, it's about some kind of internal problem with the BBC, is that when Michael Prescott, the advisor on journalistic standards, it's important to point out, this was not this is not the result of an investigation by a rival broadcaster or a newspaper. This is the result of the BBC's own advisor on editorial standards coming up with a 19-page report on what was wrong with this. When he put that to the BBC's head of news and to another senior BBC editorial director, they ignored him effectively. And was so angry about this that he then wrote to the BBC's chairman, Samir Shah, and said, look, what are you going to do about this? They're frustrating me. They're doing nothing about it. Surely you can see, his exact words were, this is setting a very dangerous precedent. And what did he get from Samir Shah, the chairman? nothing. He ignored him too. And I think you can call it a cover-up, you can call it an unwillingness to confront the BBC's problems, but whatever it is, it's bad, very bad.
And more today in regard to the bias we know exists, which is an anti-Israel bias, just as many, not all, but many in the BBC simply believe that Donald Trump is wrong about everything. We know that many in the BBC, including Jeremy Bowen, appear to believe that Israel is wrong about everything, and more evidence of that today.
Yes, there's that, but there's also, I think today as well, there's a lot of new, part of Michael Prescott's report's being released today, looking at BBC Arabic. My own former newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, we focus quite a lot on the problems with BBC Arabic, where you would have literally supporters of terrorism who would act as freelancers and so on. And you would find that there'd be two different versions of stories that they put out, as it were. One in English, which was usually sanitized, and then one in Arabic, which was not sanitized, put it that way, and which was not just biased, but dangerous and deeply misleading and incendiary in some cases.
I worked for the BBC, and I was very proud to work for the BBC, both on Newsnight, on other programmes as well in Washington and elsewhere. I worked for them for a cumulative total of about 3 years. I worked in Northern Ireland as well, although I was less proud of that particular programme that I worked on. What I would say is that I wouldn't dream of doing this, and I know lots of people I worked with who were of a very, very high standard of journalists. Some journalists I learned an awful lot from, and indeed continue to today in some cases. And this is not the whole of the BBC, but it is certainly enough of the BBC to make a mockery of so many other parts of it. I mean, I just wonder how on earth the BBC gets a handle on this bias issue, especially when there's obfuscation, when there's denial, when there is, Deborah Turness, for example, who's the BBC News chief, saying the most important thing to remember in the Gaza scandal, when the son of a terrorist was the person who was narrating a documentary, the most important thing to remember was that Hamas is two different organisations, as a political wing and a military wing, when actually everybody, and indeed anybody who knows anything about Hamas, will tell you that it's essentially all one organisation, and both sides of it anyway are prescribed under UK law.
Exactly that. I mean, this is, I think you get to the nub of it, really. The issue is, what do you do? The thing is, this is not some recent development. If this had been something that, had arisen in the last few years, then you could perhaps look at it and say, well, systemically, what's the problem? But it's not. I mean, I remember literally 25 years ago, Andrew Marr, when he was the BBC's political editor, I think he'd just left, writing a piece about acknowledging the fact that there was an inherent bias in the BBC. The bias he referred to, I think quite rightly, was that it was a kind of left liberal bias. It wasn't a deliberate. The point is, it wasn't. The issue I think that's so pertinent about this is that it's deliberate, and there's a deliberate distortion. I think the more insidious bias, in a way, is. And it's not the BBC's fault, this in some ways, the kind of left liberal bias, it's the pool from which many journalists are drawn from. So they come into it with an instinctive idea that, profit is wrong, that, businesses exploit people, that all migration is good. We can go through a list of the various things, but that informs their journalism. And, in a way, it's not the BBC's fault that they have journalists who think like that. The problem is that there's nothing there to correct it. And indeed, one of the points that Michael Prescott makes in his memo today, or that was published today and yesterday, is that when it had, for instance, this hour-long Panorama program on Donald Trump, which, understandably and rightly scrutinized him, I think it's entirely right to do that. The point that Michael Prescott made, however, was that there was absolutely nothing doing the same for Kamala Harris. No. So it was as if, yes, Trump, obviously we're going to scrutinize him, but no, we're going to we'll leave her alone because she's obviously a decent candidate. Yeah.
And that is the problem that happens so often. Stephen, great to talk to you. I hope we speak again soon. That's Stephen Pollard there, who is a writer and former editor of the Jewish Chronicle. What do you think about this? 0344 499 1000. Pete says the BBC now trying to find excuses to get out of it. I hope Trump sues the BBC. Stephen says the BBC story is straight out of 1984. Talk about the Ministry of Truth. Time something was done about it. That's Stephen in Manchester. Let me know your thoughts. 0344 499 1000. Lots to discuss.